Greetings, Starfighters. Welcome to episode 3 of season 10 of Shameless Cashgrab, the show where I make jokes about a movie that I watched, while maybe only occasionally dipping into serious analysis, but I guarantee you that any serious analysis that I have is only stuff that I learned from watching much better film YouTubers, people who are actually critics as opposed to me. Y'all understand that I'm not a critic, right? Just checking. I think I might have referred to myself as one a couple of times really early on, like way back in season 1, but that's not this show. Anyway, Otley, or Otley, probably Otley. I don't know why I called it Otley at the end of the last episode, because that's not even close to how this is spelled. Based on an admittedly cursory glance at the plot summary on the back here, I'm thinking this might lean more towards comedy, maybe dark comedy, than an actual thriller, but hey, these things happen with these sets. I mean, I think in terms of sheer number of why is this on this set movies, season 3 has yet to be topped, but I don't really recognize any of the names on here. I think. Oh, that is so freaking tiny. This one does also seem to be based on a book, like actually every movie this season so far. let me do a quick check here. Yeah, it looks like episode 4 is based on a book too. Well, we'll get to that. This is about episode 3. This is about Otley, or Otley, from 1968. And yeah, let's go ahead and watch this movie. Make jokes about it. Maybe have an actually genuinely insightful opinion. That is not a guarantee with this show. And yeah, bird set off the driveway laser. Let's go into the part of the episode where I have watched the movie.
Okay, so I have now watched Otley from 1969. Nice. As an aside, this is now the 80th movie I have watched for this show. Nice round number there. Plot summary is courtesy of IMDb. Gerald Arthur Otley, a petty thief and garbage rummager, wakes up one morning after a drunken night on the town and finds that he is wanted by the police for murder, and that is only the beginning. While being pursued for a crime he did not commit, he is kidnapped by a group of criminals who suspect him of being involved with double agents. Otley manages to escape, but cannot avoid getting into one nearly fatal crisis after another, as police and foreign agents chase after him. It is a wild week of misadventures which he will never forget. The opening credits of the movie are a pretty well done, almost 2.5-minute long, unbroken shot of the main character walking down a fairly crowded street in London, while a song called Homeless Bones plays. I was curious, so I went ahead and looked it up. The song was actually co-written and performed for the movie by a guy named Don Partridge, who had a prolific career in folk music in the UK, and had collaborated with an impressive array of people over his career, including Otis Redding, Donovan, Paul Lennon, and Paul Lennon? I'm leaving that in, that was just so silly. John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Yeah, you can see how I got Paul Lennon out of that, right? Mick Jagger and Keith Richards as well. That's a pretty impressive career. We transition from the credits to Otley being evicted from his apartment after a night in bed with the landlord, an older woman, for being 3 months behind in rent, and after having fenced just about everything in what had been a fully furnished complex, and trying to pin the blame on a cleaning service employee. Nobody for me to really be on the side of here, is there? Because, on the one hand, you got a thief trying to screw over an innocent laborer, and then on the other, you have a landlord who extorted a tenant for sex and then evicted him anyway. As they would say on r/am I the asshole, everybody sucks here. After a short montage of Otley trying and failing to find someplace else to sleep for the night, we get a conversation between two people we don't know at the back of a pub Otley has sat down in. We don't know who either of these men are yet, but it's safe to assume that this happening out of our main character's earshot means it's plot important. After an exchange about money that includes an implied threat, both men leave and part ways. Otley bumps into one of them, and the two know each other, and Otley tries to convince the man to let him crash on his couch for a few days, while the taller of the two looks at them ominously from his car. We get a party scene after this with some humor to it that requires context, so I won't try to repeat any of it here, it'd just get mangled. Otley manages to embarrass himself while attempting to flirt with a woman, largely keeping to herself at the party, but when the shorter guy from the pub scene mentioned earlier shows up at the same party, Otley is able to convince him finally, off-screen, to let him crash at his place. This is where the movie diverges somewhat from the plot summary. Otley may have been drunk, but I wouldn't call the party scene a night on the town. Regardless, while falling asleep and after pocketing a knick-knack from the guy's table to probably try and sell later, the other man is shot to death in his kitchen, with a silencer, working the way they only do in movies. Yeah, by the way, in case you don't know this, there's a fair chance that you do already. I mean, it's been covered like on Mythbusters and whatnot. But silencers don't actually quiet the sound a gun makes when it fires. I don't entirely understand the science of this. Honestly, I always did badly in science class in school, but it makes it harder to tell what direction it's coming from. It's only in movies where it you use a gun with a silencer so that like someone in the next room can't hear you or whatever. But enough about that. Otley mistakes the sound of the coffee pot shattering. The guy was holding a coffee pot when he was shot. He mistakes it for having been dropped, and he just rolls over and ignores it. Only to be woken up lying outside on the grass with a light shining in his face. He's groggy at first, but the passenger jet going right over his head wakes him up quick, and he realizes he's on the grass by the runways at an airport with his boots, which he'd taken off before lying down, on him again, only on the wrong feet. The knick-knack he tried to steal is missing, but that doesn't really occur to him in the moment. But it does come back later. He also learns it's been more than a whole day. He's missing a whole day. This gets brought up to him more than a few times. Apparently his friends lost a soccer game, well, football as they call it, because of his absence. He returns to his neighborhood where a snooty little brat informs him the police have been around looking for him. While shaving at the snooty brat's parents' house, two men show up at the door, punch him in the stomach, Otley, not the snooty brat, and throw him into the back of their car. So, cops, I'm guessing. No, turns out they're the criminals from the plot summary, including the taller man from the conversation Otley didn't overhear at the pub, and the woman he'd struck out with at the party. But if you've been paying attention to the news for like the last 30 years or so, can you blame me for thinking they were cops? Anyway, the criminals, one of whom obviously has the flu, asks Otley if he killed the guy whose couch he'd been sleeping on, named Lambert. After, eventually, being satisfied that he didn't kill anyone, the woman from the party, Imogen, and Otley find themselves being chased by parties unknown and end up having to steal a car from the parking lot of a golf club to evade them. And that there was because I used the wrong word in the script that I had to correct it to club. Yeah, can you tell I'm trying to pad these videos out a little bit lately? Shortly after this, Otley, after retrieving his belongings from the house he'd been at before being abducted, goes to a couple he knows on their houseboat to ask for help. When the same people who'd chased him and Imogen at the golf club turn up, he flees, sandwich in hand, hoping to go to the police himself, hoping that cooperating will help him clear his name. He ultimately fails after attempting to blend in with a protest crowd, not realizing until it was too late that he was the only white person in it, which made him stand out, and is pushed into the back of yet another car. This happens to him several times in the movie. It qualifies as a running gag. It's not a bad one, per se. I didn't hate it, but I didn't particularly get that many laughs out of it either. But that's entering final verdict territory. Otley is brought to an office occupied by two men for whom the phrase gay stereotypes could be considered an understatement, and after a rather pointless snipe at Middle Eastern decor, our new villain for the piece makes it pretty clear that his organization, called ICS, is who killed Lambert, and that they want to find out if he knew anything that Lambert knew. Otley doesn't know anything, and if he did, he'd happily give it up, but is still threatened with torture by our new villain's henchman, Paul. The conversation is interrupted by a phone call, and we learn the villain's name is Proudfoot, a name which was dropped when Otley was being interrogated by the other people who had kidnapped him earlier in the movie, when they asked Otley if he had been working for him. Otley is then bound and gagged and put in the back of a bus that takes him to a farm. The driver of the bus reveals himself as the man who'd killed Lambert, but when Proudfoot calls him up, he claims Otley was never delivered to him. After hanging up, he offers an understandably confused Otley some coffee. The assassin then brings the knick-knack I'd mentioned earlier out of a drawer, which it turns out had a hidden recording device in it. The assassin had assumed Otley was involved with something when it had fallen out of his pocket while he was being dragged to the airport. The assassin puts Otley to work on his farm. The two take part in some kind of deal with the criminals from earlier in the movie that involves a briefcase in a tube station, a briefcase that blows up while the assassin is holding it when he's about ready to shoot Otley. Having once again survived due to dumb luck, Otley leaves, tries to turn himself into the police, which ends up taking a bit, as the cops he tries to approach are too busy bothering a group of youths over drugs to pay any attention to the wanted murder suspect trying to surrender. This is sadly realistic, even now. Eventually he's listened to and brought to a station to be interrogated, but there's still more than a half hour left of the movie, so we know this is going to go sideways somehow. Which it does when Imogene shows up and takes Otley with her, reluctantly as he feels much safer in a holding cell than outside at the moment. She reveals that the taller man she'd been working with when they'd been interrogating Otley has disappeared, and she takes him to yet another car where the father of the snooty brat who's been showing up throughout the movie is working with her too. He reveals to Otley that his group has been working with the government's blessing against ICS. They try to get Otley to help them one last time, but he nopes out to go to a driving test he'd scheduled before everything else happened, only to spot a car with two of the people who had been working with the tall man. He attempts to get away from them in the training car, with the driving instructor in the passenger seat, and does an admirable job for a good 10 minutes or so before being caught anyway, and ultimately being brought to a government building to be officially drafted into helping bring down ICS. He eventually agrees to go along after being offered money. Otley meets up with Proudfoot at the Playboy Club. Yes, really, I didn't even know they had one of those in London. And far as I can tell, it was open off and on until 2022. I couldn't find out why it closed, but to be honest, I don't care. So Otley convinces Proudfoot that he's been working for the CIA this whole time, somehow, and Imogene gives him a transmitter disguised as a cigarette lighter, a staple of the spy genre. There's always something described as a cigarette lighter. Transmitter, gun, recording device, laser. Anyway, yeah, it's also they can track him. While undercover at some kind of health spa to get in good with Proudfoot, somehow, Otley makes an incredibly racist comment that the movie doesn't seem to think is a big deal, so that sucked. A bit of convoluted spy stuff happens that would probably take me longer to describe accurately than it took to watch the movie, so I'll just yada yada over that. To Otley encountering the tall man at the now blowed up assassin's farm. Otley fails to be as convincing to the tall guy as he was to Proudfoot, and narrowly avoids being killed with a hunting gun, though some of the pellets do get him in the leg. He is able to knock the tall man down using the dead assassin's bus, injuring the tall man's back. Otley runs into the house to get something to help the tall man's injury, not wanting to have killed anyone, but of all people, the minister of the government agency that roped Otley into this operation in the first place backs over the tall man with the bus, killing him. Displaying a rare bit of agency for the film, Otley tries to secretly record the minister confessing to having killed the tall man in order to cover his own involvement with ICS, basically playing both sides of a conflict. The minister tells Otley to not worry about being offed himself, as he's not really in a position to do anything about it, and plans to get Otley off the hook for the tall guy's death by chalking it up to inexperience, making it seem like the death of someone who was meant to be captured alive was the result of a rookie agent's mistake during a life-or-death situation. Anyway, remember how I said Otley tried to record the conversation? So the knick-knack with their recording device in it from earlier was still in the house, and Otley was able to pocket it again and opened it without the minister noticing. I think I might have mentioned that already. I got sidetracked by some outdoor noises. And, that would have been a major victory, if not for the fact that Otley forgot to hit record. Something he only realizes when he goes to play the tape for Imogene and the snooty brat's parents. I'm sure they have names, I just forgot them. The minister gets knighted, as was referenced was going to happen at the party scene towards the start of the movie. Otley goes back to scratching out a living on the streets of London. The woman from the couple on the houseboat invites Otley to stay with her while her boyfriend is out of town for 2 weeks. And we all know where that's going, since the boyfriend was kind of a jerk to her throughout the movie. The end credits play a reprise of the song from the opening, The End. Random thoughts I had while watching the movie. There's a decent amount of location shooting for this movie. Very little seems to have been filmed on a soundstage. It looks nicer than a movie of this type usually does, and I appreciate that. 2. Did I remember to say 1 for the first one? It doesn't matter. 2. The protest crowd I mentioned earlier was amusing in the way that their silence and the professional way they dressed clashed with the fiery rhetoric on their signs. 3. Our main character, who isn't a farmer, ends up on a farm, so of course there's a stepping in shit gag. It's short though, and no stupid music or sound effects are played over it. Plus, this movie was made well before that gag became hacky and tired and insultingly easy to predict, so I guess I'll give it a pass. I still didn't laugh at it, though. And 4. Even though this movie is on the Cold War thriller set, it is actually never specified who exactly ICS works for. I mean, we could probably infer that it's the Soviet Union, but it's never made explicit. Not sure why they bothered to make it vague, to be honest. Maybe that's just how it was in the book this was based on. Oh, and 5, something that I just remembered. Imogene does say to Otley before they part ways for the last time that she and some other people she worked with believe him about the minister, so they're going to arrange for him to have a health crisis that will force him to retire early in about 6 months. That feels kind of tacked on. I'm guessing that wasn't in the book, but again, I never read it. Final verdict. While this movie did make me laugh many times, they weren't very big laughs. More like sensible chuckles. Much of the humor of the movie comes less from any one-liners or clever dialogue or slapstick, though a little of each of those is present, but from how little control over the plot the title character has. Most of the plot happens to him rather than because of him. And even some of the jokes in the movie are things happening in the background that have no bearing on the plot whatsoever. So, is this a bad movie? No, I wouldn't say so at all. Even with the parts that have aged poorly, this movie is like 55 years old at this point. But is it good? I wouldn't say that either. This is what I would call a solid 3-star movie. Not great, not terrible, just okay. The actual definition of mid. I know film Twitter uses the word mid to insult movies a lot these days, but these people also think that it's the MCU's fault that apparently Gen Z isn't as interested in explicit sex scenes in cinema anymore. So what do they know? Mid just means middle of the road, and that's where I'd put this movie. It's fine. Anyway, tune in next time when we start getting into some harder stuff, if the R ratings on the back of the DVD case for the next 2 movies is any indication. See you next month for a movie titled A Dandy in Aspic. Have fun. Stay safe. I would just like to add, I'm actually quite proud of myself. Most of the stuff I'm having to edit out of this MP3 before sending it to the editor comes from noises outside the office, not from my own flubs. I'm getting better at this. Only took me about 7 years.